After reviewing the entire 3D Realms anthology in 2015, I knew for a long time that I wanted to do another long series, this time covering the catalogue of another titan of the golden age of shareware in which I grew up. Epic Megagames, as they were known for most of the time period these videos will cover, was founded by Tim Sweeney from his home in Maryland in the USA when he was just 20 years old. Like me, he missed out on the early console games and grew up with the computers of the time instead, and developed a keen interest in programming as a result. He started on an Apple II where he learned BASIC, and then experimented with more complex programs by using the very 80s method of just typing reams of hex opcodes into a debugger. He moved up to the PC in 1989 once it was clear the Apple II was becoming obsolete, and realised that there was massive potential in the burgeoning game industry when he discovered the games that Apogee and id Software were releasing. Tim Sweeney's own company started life under the name Potomac Computer Systems because at the time it had been intended to be a consulting company for business computing. However, after programming his first game on the side while attending college and finding huge success from it with an income of about $100 a day, he chose to shift his focus entirely to games instead. He chose to rename his company Epic Megagames to make it appear much bigger and more established than its reality of having exactly one employee. But from this small beginning, Epic rapidly grew into a company much like Apogee, positioning itself as both a game development house and a distributor and publisher for games written by others. Nowadays, they're enjoying worldwide success with titles like the Gears of War series and the near-ubiquitous Unreal Engine. No complete collection of Epic games is currently available for download, but I've scraped together a list of my own from the corners of the internet, and will try to detail the best way to find them as I go through. To begin with, we're going back to 1991 with a title that looks very simple compared to the one on screen just now, but that inspired his philosophy behind many of Epic's games that persists to this day. In my ambitious effort to comment on every Epic game ever made in chronological order, I immediately run into a problem here because the very first one is tremendously meaningful to me, and I could easily talk about this game and its culture and community for about 3 hours on its own. Nevertheless, I'll attempt to stick to the details of the game and will provide some extra reading at the end. The first ever game to be released under the Epic name was ZZT, and if my pronunciation of that sounds weird or unnatural to you, brace yourself because I'm going to be saying it a lot more. It was released in 1991 and went through a couple of revisions being credited to Potomac Computer Systems before the Epic company name was decided on. The reason for ZZT's curious name is because Tim Sweeney saw many software authors fighting to come up with names for files that would alphabetically put them at the top of file listings on the bulletin board systems of the time. Therefore, he chose instead to give it a name that would ensure it was easy to find as the last entry in the list. It wasn't meant to mean anything further. At one point, someone suggested it could stand for Zoo of Zero Tolerance, but this is not commonly accepted due to it being the stupidest name ever. ZZT has unusual origins, owing its existence largely to a failed attempt to write a text editor. Tim Sweeney was working on making an editing environment for his original, more business-oriented company, and had got as far as moving a cursor around a screen. Then he got distracted and started making certain characters block the cursor's path, and then gradually added more elements that behaved in different ways, such as sliding blocks and enemies to avoid. Before long, the original editor had become completely unrecognisable under all these elements, and what he had instead was an environment for constructing top-down sort of action puzzle adventures rendered in text mode characters. As a result, the whole thing bears a strong resemblance to Kingdom of Kroz, the game that had kicked off Apogee Software in 1987, but Tim insists that he hadn't seen Kroz before ZZT took shape. Taking a page out of Apogee's book, though, Tim split the initial release into 4 episodes, which in ZZT terms are called Worlds. World 1, the town of ZZT, was released for free as shareware, and 3 other worlds were available upon registering. Most of these follow pretty much the same formula. In Town and the next 2 worlds, Caves and Dungeon, the player has somehow got lost or become trapped somewhere and must find 5 purple keys, here represented by Venus symbols, to secure their freedom. To find the keys, they have to explore the non-linear worlds, making it past a selection of ASCII enemies, mazes and puzzles, with the player actions being limited to moving around, shooting in the 4 cardinal directions, and bumping into things to pick them up or interact with them. The challenges you'll face in the games are quite varied, but some common themes are dealing with puzzles made out of boulders and sliders, fighting your way through hordes of wild animals including bullet-spewing turquoise tigers, and some simple interactions with other characters who give you clues and items to proceed. Despite its simple gameplay and appearance, which was already very dated when the game was released alongside EGA extravaganzas like Commander Keen and Duke Nukem 1, Tim came up with an interesting variety of set pieces, as well as a rather charming oddball tone for the game, and ZZT sold like floppy disk-shaped hotcakes and paved the way for Epic's future. The exception to the standard formula is the 4th world, City of ZZT, which is a little more linear in nature and doesn't have the purple keys to collect. Instead, it's a shorter affair that feels more adventure game-like, with items that are picked up to be used later on in exchange for other items, and it showcases more of the things that could be done with ZZT scripting as opposed to the built-in keys, doors and enemies. The ZZT environment includes a language awkwardly called ZZT-OOP, short for Object-Oriented Programming, which could be used to create custom objects with unique behaviour. And the editor and scripting language were truly the lifeblood of ZZT. It was one of the first games to actively encourage its players to create and distribute new content, and was frequently brought up as a comparison when Media Molecule's Little Big Planet was released with the same philosophy nearly 2 decades later. Unlike many other games of the time, the editor was built right into the program and could be switched to by pressing the E key from the title screen, and it wasn't even locked behind the registered version. Everyone who had ZZT could access it. From the editor, the player had access to all the tools that Tim Sweeney had used to construct his 4 worlds. Consequently, many hundreds of ZZT worlds spread across the early internet on services such as AOL, and were collected on fan sites, with some groups such as Software Visions and Interactive Fantasies becoming very well known for their ZZT games. The scripting language is a deceptively powerful thing despite its simplicity, and is based around the concept of objects sending messages to each other. For example, one of the early boards in the Shareware episode features a building with a doorbell which you can press to attract the attention of the guard patrolling inside. If we open up this board in the editor, we can look at the object's script. From here, we can see that it's named door by this line starting with an @ sign, and it's told to immediately stop running anything automatically by the end command. When the player pushes against any object, that object will attempt to jump to a label called touch, with labels denoted by a colon preceding them. This object has such a label, so when the player presses it, the program will jump to here. Continuing down the way, it will then send a message to the patrolling guardian inside, which causes his program to jump to the label that the doorbell tells him to. In this case, it's called ding. Over on the guardian's script, he has a short loop to make him pace back and forward, but will be interrupted by the doorbell and will jump to the ding label. From there, he locks himself, meaning he'll ignore further messages until he's unlocked, and then feels his way to the door based on looking at which walls are next to him. Once there, he tells you to go away and then returns to what he was doing before, leaving the player able to bother him again by touching the doorbell a second time. The language lacks any definable variables apart from 10 flags that can be set and checked, but conditional branches can be formed in more physical ways, like in the portion of the script that deals with the guard's movement, by doing things like getting the object to check that it's blocked from moving in any direction, or if a certain type of object exists on the board, and reacting based on that. You can also make objects do different things depending on how many times a label has been called. For example, I might want to make the doorbell do nothing the first time it's pressed, before the guard eventually pays attention to you on the second try. This is accomplished by setting up 2 copies of the same label and using the zap command, which performs the unorthodox function of modifying the object's script while it's running. When zap is used, the first label by the given name is commented out at runtime, making subsequent calls to that same label instead find the next one down in the program. If you want to reverse the process, you can use the restore command, which looks for a comment with the given text and turns it into a label. While all this might sound like the maddest thing that a language has ever done, it's surprising how little you think about its strangeness within the general ethos of ZZT. Once you've grasped the logic, the elements are there to allow players to create a lot of things very easily. However, where ZZT gets really interesting is in what it could do that you weren't supposed to do. By some kind of unrepeatable magic, the executable contains a variety of convenient oversights that allowed people to extend it beyond Tim Sweeney's intentions. The most obvious limit of the default editor was that you were restricted to using just the 7 bold text mode colours: blue, green, cyan, red, magenta, yellow and white, all on black backgrounds. However, some enterprising hacking undertaken by a prominent ZZTer called Alexis Janssen led to the discovery that it was possible to assign the entire set of 16 text mode colours to characters by messing with the saved world files, including assigning background colours other than the default black. And once you had a rogue tile like this in the data, ZZT didn't care about it. It would faithfully copy and paste it in the editor the same as it did for any other regular tile, and it would behave as expected in the game. This discovery caused a huge transformation in ZZT games, and talented graphics artists of the community were able to construct really genuinely impressive visuals rendered in DOS ASCII characters. Many accidental effects were discovered in the scripting language and the behaviour of objects as well, so many that an encyclopedia of demos was maintained in the late 90s by Kronos30 and JDM Sonic, detailing the advanced techniques that had been discovered. A lot of the fascination of ZZT comes from putting odd building blocks like this together, being able to assemble something that works through relying on the unusually physical nature of the scripting language, setting up mathematics and decisions through strange Rube Goldberg contraptions. The absolute pinnacle of this unique school of coding is demonstrated in Preposterous Machines, an astounding collection of scripting demos put together somewhere around 2010 by Drake Wilson. It performs algorithms like calculating a Mandelbrot set and solving the Towers of Brahma entirely without the benefit of arithmetic or other things you would normally consider fairly vital. On a slightly more usual level, ZZT world makers were able to put together very unlikely engines and huge multipath action-adventure games or role-playing game-like battle systems, a massive leap from what ZZT had originally been envisioned as. So, despite its simple looks on the surface, ZZT was massively influential to many people due to its wide shareware distribution and the ease with which it was possible to pick up the editor and fiddle with making a game of your own. It inspired a whole international network of awkward teenagers to experiment with programming games or writing interactive stories in its limited environment, and its accidental stack of interesting bugs and workarounds gave it the intrigue necessary to support a fascinated community which lasted well into the 21st century. If you'd like to know more about the community around ZZT and the influence that it had on people, I strongly recommend reading Anna Anthropy's book on ZZT published by Boss Fight Books in 2014, which is available digitally on their site for about $5. I went into it thinking that I would be reading an account of the history of ZZT's development and the technology behind it, but what I got instead was a fascinating insight into what the surrounding community meant for a young trans person trapped in an unwelcoming real-life environment, and how she found support and a place she belonged through the unlikely band of misfits that had gravitated to ZZT's community. In this way, Tim Sweeney's little text mode game really has changed people's lives for the better in a way that nobody could ever have foreseen. One of the best places to get the game itself, as well as a guide for getting it up and running, is the Museum of ZZT. This is a fairly recent site that was put together by Dr. Doss, who was one of the administrators of the popular Z2 ZZT community site in the early 2000s, and it aims to catalogue ZZT games and detail their history. It also features a ton of in-depth articles about notable games as well as insight into some of the engine's lesser-known oddities. All the registered version game worlds were declared freeware in 1997 and can be found among the museum's file archives. However, mail orders for the registered game still kept coming into Tim Sweeney's parents' house for years afterwards and were faithfully fulfilled by his retired father until he eventually ran out of discs in the year 2013. ZZT was a huge success that kick-started the New Games Company in a big way, and Tim Sweeney capitalised on it quickly by releasing a sequel called Super ZZT in early 1992. Like its predecessor, it's constructed out of ASCII characters, but this time it uses the DOS 40-character widescreen mode to give a chunkier, more square look than the original game. The major innovation over the original was that the playfield could now scroll around in 4 directions, allowing larger rooms overall but giving the player a more limited view of them at once. In doing this, Tim was trying to evoke the Ultima games and the sense of exploration you got by moving through a large world that extended beyond the boundaries of the screen. Tim Sweeney had very grand visions for Super ZZT, but they never quite came to fruition. His initial aim was to make these boards extend to thousands of characters in width and height, with the game's world being loaded dynamically as the player explored, but he ended up settling for board sizes of just 96 by 80 squares, which, to put it in perspective, is still over 3 times the size of a regular ZZT board, so the worlds definitely feel more expansive. In the official Super ZZT games, transitioning from board to board doesn't happen as often as it does in the original engine, with the player instead exploring larger continuous expanses of game world. The other idea that Tim had thought up for a sequel was to make it run on bulletin board systems and have multiple players able to dial in and interact with each other in the same world. The text-based nature of BBSs would have been ideal for representing a ZZT-like environment, but in the end he tempered his ambitions and released something that he knew he'd be able to do quickly before moving on to other games. So Super ZZT ended up being very similar to the original under the hood despite the change in graphical style. The scripting language is almost exactly the same, with the only enhancement being the detection of a hint key to allow the player to request clues. However, a few more built-in enemies are provided, including these spiders which are very fast but confined to the new web terrain. In terms of other game elements, the most significant new one is water, with currents that act like a conveyor belt pushing you in the direction their arrow points towards. And lava takes the place of water from regular ZZT, being an obstacle that you can shoot across but not step into. Different coloured floors are also provided now, which would have been only possible with the advanced colour hackery in the original game, and with the additional colours being made available in the editor this time, the games made with the default editor in this environment can look a lot more varied overall. Oddly, the episodes are arranged in reverse in this release. They're numbered from 5 to 7 to add on to the original 4 games, but the 7th episode is the one that's available as shareware, with the previous 2 included with the registered version. Episode 7, Monster Zoo, is a nice adventure through the levels of a demented menagerie that introduces the new game elements, and it's also the first Epic release to have a name other than Tim Sweeney on it, having been written by Alan Pilgrim. Tim had signed him up to write a new official episode for ZZT after discovering a world that Alan had made for the original game called Fantasy. Moving on to the registered games, the 6th episode, Lost Forest, is another adventure by Tim Sweeney where you have to rescue some trees by collecting stones of power. And the final episode, Proving Grounds, is a way of filling up some space. I don't want to be too harsh to it, but Proving Grounds is noticeably a lot blander than the rest of the episodes. It takes more of an action game approach than the others, doesn't really attempt to have a setting, and feels like a series of straight arena fights broken up with the occasional puzzle. It isn't terrible, but it does lack some of the charm that the other adventures exhibited. But the real blunder in Super ZZT was that Tim Sweeney hid the editor. Given that he had invited people to submit their custom original ZZT worlds back to him, it seems a bit odd that he wouldn't have realised how vital the editor was to the popularity of the game, but for whatever reason, the Super ZZT editor is only accessible by using a command line switch that wasn't even documented. It instead had to be revealed in Epic Games' newsletter shortly after the game's release. Once you get into it, the editor is recognisable as the original one with a coat of paint over it. The function keys have been rearranged a bit to accommodate the new monsters and elements that were introduced with the sequel, along with controls to make use of the extended colour palette. However, just like during gameplay, you're given a limited scrolling viewport to look at the large board size, and this makes editing a world much more awkward than it was for the original game. This restricted view also limits what you can do with puzzles when the player needs to be able to see large parts of the board at once. Overall, while this sequel wasn't disastrous, it certainly never attained the popularity that the original had. The default worlds still have their charm, and the idea of the scrolling environment making the game seem more mysterious definitely worked. I had remembered Monster Zoo being immense, even though in reality it seems to be only 7 boards long. However, compared to the wild success of the original, the game sold only about 1 copy a day at its peak. You can now get it, and the registered worlds, on the Museum of ZZT. Super ZZT would be followed by several more official releases, although all of them used the original ZZT engine rather than the Super one due to it being vastly more popular. The Best of ZZT contest was set up by Tim Sweeney to encourage players to submit their own content for an official compilation. However, the response was so overwhelming that the results had to be split across 8 new game worlds, making the new collection longer than the whole original series. 2 of these worlds were mashups of individual screens or puzzles from many authors, called The Best of ZZT Part 1, The Secret of Headhunter Isle, and Part 2, Royal Treasures. This title screen, depicting a castle sticking both its middle fingers up at you, is accidentally a great metaphor for these games, as they are both hard as nails. They were compiled by another new face, Scott Hudson, and both of them feature a variety of puzzles that range from overwhelming to insurmountable, all dreamt up by various fans of the original ZZT games. In addition to the already lengthy Best of ZZT games, a further 6 submissions to the contest were released in their entirety, bundled together as yet another package called ZZT's Revenge. Epic was able to grow their network significantly through these submissions, recruiting entrants such as Alan Pilgrim and Adam Rixey to work on further games under their banner. As you can see, Epic got a lot of mileage out of the humble text mode ZZT, almost as much as I have in this video, having been talking about it for nearly 20 minutes now, but they were now growing from being a one-person company and moving on to bigger things.